Scott. I wanted to ask you about the latest with the Oreshnik development. We haven't talked much about this since it was initially launched on Ukraine, but I know that there's been more updates on this, as well as Putin's warning about moving up the escalation ladder, willingness to strike Ukraine again, Kiev this time, should these escalations continue, as you're already alluding to. So could you help educate the audience as what we now know more about this missile and its capabilities, as well as what we can expect Russia to do next?
Let's start with the U.S. intelligence community. I just spent some time bashing them because of the politicization of their intelligence. That doesn't mean that at the lower levels, at the collector level, that we can't collect information. And we have, since the early 1980s, focused a tremendous amount of resources on intelligence collection platforms and capabilities that track, Russian missile development. So when the U.S. intelligence community said that this was an experimental missile that was a derivative of the RS-26 Rubyezh missile, which was a missile that was developed in the early teens, 2000 teens, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, I think it was mothballed eventually. Mothballed because it was in violation of the INF treaty. So they said, well, we got to, we either have to declare it as an ICBM. It was tested once or twice at ICBM range, which technically allowed it to be classified as an ICBM, but the warhead configurations, they were talking about 3 avant-gardes, for example, would have made it impossible for it to go ICBM range, which would have made it an intermediate range. So rather than deal with the legalities of it, the Russians just mothballed the system. But when Trump withdrew from the INF treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty that was implemented back in signed in 87, we got the 37th anniversary of it coming up this week, December 8th. Implemented in 88, I was the first INF weapons inspector on the ground in the Soviet Union, more by luck than skill, but still, it's a nice title to have. But I am intimately familiar with the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and the weapon systems involved. And, these are very dangerous systems, destabilizing systems, and we got rid of them. We saved the world, literally. But Trump withdrew from that treaty. Putin said at that time that he's not going to develop intermediate missiles and deploy them as long as the United States and Europe doesn't put any intermediate range systems in Europe. Well, in September 2023, we did just that. We brought in what we call the containerized launch system, put it in an exercise in Denmark, and the Russians shouldn't have done that. And in July of this past year, Vladimir Putin apparently, and he publicly talked about this, alluded to it, but gave orders to bring the Rubyezh back out of mothballs and bring it online. The problem is you still have the Rubyezh was designed because of the INF treaty. They were trying to get an intermediate range capable missile that could be classified as an ICBM because of treaty requirements, but it was to meet an operational mission, meaning missions where you can fire a missile without fear of being called an ICBM attack. The mission, though, of this new development of the Rubyezh was no longer the mission that it was designed for back in the 80s. It now became a weapon of response to the introduction of intermediate range missiles into Europe by the United States, namely the Dark Eagle, which is a hypersonic missile that we've already deployed certain elements, but the missile hasn't been fully developed yet. But it's supposed to be deployed by early 2026. If that happens, the Russians have to have a system able to respond rapidly. We go back to the Cold War, 1982, when the United States was talking about deploying the Pershing II missile, which is, again, very destabilizing from the Russian standpoint. 7 minutes after launch, 7 to 12 minutes, it hits Moscow. Not acceptable. So the Russians developed a system they called the Skorost. The Skorost was just basically they said we need a missile that can rapidly strike Pershing II sites when the Pershings go out in the field to stop them from launching. That's why it's called Skuros, quick, rapid. Well, they didn't design it from scratch. What they did is they went into the Vodkinsk and at that time Nadaradze design bureau's toolbox and said, we'll take a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, put it together. Boom, we got a Skoros. They went out, tested it, put it into development. It was ready to rock and roll. Then the INF treaty came and it died. But it was still a valid concept conceptually. The Russian strategic missile forces, with the treaty no longer there, when Putin said we need to respond to Dark Eagle, they said, boss, we got a plan for that. But we're not going to call it Skoros, but it's going to be similar. We're going to build a system that's intermediate range. We're not going to design it from scratch. We know what we want, so we're going to go pick parts, pieces here, there, and everywhere. And it looks like they picked a first stage from I think it's the Yars M. It's an all new first stage, all new solid fuel technology, design, the whole thing, top of the line. They have a second stage. I don't know where it came from, to be honest. And it may not be a major second stage, more of just something that separates from the first stage and allows to get up there. But the third stage appears to be what we call a third stage. It's not normally. It's a post-boost vehicle. So if once you separate, if you have multiple independently targeted reentry vehicles, MIRVs, on this bus, the bus will separate, and then the bus it has gas ports that and it separates and aims, and then releases the MIRV on targets based upon the geometry of its trajectory, and it can deploy those. And generally speaking, they deploy in a linear fashion. So it's boom, 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 or boom, 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 boom. But it's linear because the bus keeps its trajectory going. The new missile, and again, Putin alluded to this. He said, and we even made use of something in the new Yars M. Well, what the new Yars M incorporates is this new concept of independently retargeted post-boost vehicles, meaning instead of one with the MIRVs on it, there's 6 that are independently targeted. So they'll fire and they can go off on their own, accelerate on their own, maneuver on their own, and hit their targets on their own. Each one of these 6 then has 6 of these submunitions. These are non-explosive tungsten rods, appear to be coated with some sort of exotic carbide alloy that can absorb heat, traveling at Mach 10, get up to over 4,000 degrees centigrade. And when they hit the ground with the combination of the velocity and the heat, they literally, at that heat, reinforced concrete literally vaporizes. And so the idea was to lay that down. This missile was designed to take out Dark Eagle. So when Dark Eagle deploys, it's going to deploy launcher, radar, command and control, maybe some more launchers. One Oreshnik is designed to come in and saturate an area, again, with these 6 independently targeted things, boom, 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 and take out the Dark Eagle deployment. That's the purpose of Oreshnik, and it was developed to do this. The U.S. intelligence community called it right. They called it an experimental missile, and probably a derivative of the RS-26 Rubyezh. But the Russians, even though it was a derivative, they're using the launcher and a launch canister of similar dimensions, but the missile itself is an all-new missile. Putin apparently is telling the truth on this one. But this missile, was designed to do a specific job, not the job that it was given. What this missile has become is a weapon of deterrence, a strategic weapon of deterrence. That is, we use this weapon, first time in history, an intermediate range missile of this caliber has been used in combat, a major escalation in its own right. But the idea of the Russians are saying, if you keep attacking us with attackums, here we got this, we're attacked. And the idea was to inflict so much damage with this look, it looked impressive. Everybody who saw it went, whoa, that's something weird. 6 things come in with these miniature things coming in, glowing in the dark, all that. The problem is, while Russia seems to be, I've never seen Putin with such a Cheshire cat smile on his face as he's briefing before. He is just pleased as can be. The briefing he's getting obviously is that this system did what it was supposed to do, did a lot of damage. Ukraine has said it did very little damage, but Ukraine's not letting anybody into the site. And there's been no high resolution imagery coming from the site of the damage. And the United States is likewise sort of spread the rumors that it will, wow, it looked cool, but it didn't really do that much damage. Here's the problem. That battle damage assessment from the West caused the United States to say, Oreshnik doesn't intimidate us. We're going to keep letting Ukraine launch ATACMS, which Ukraine has done on several occasions now, escalating. This prompted Putin to say, hey, I'm going to, we're looking at more targets, and we could use more than one Oreshnik in these strikes. So far, Russia hasn't pulled that trigger, but I think it's inevitable they will if these ATACMS attacks continue. I think Russia's trying to send the signals behind the scenes that, guys, we don't want this escalation, because after this, 2 or 3 iterations down the road, we only got one thing left to do, which is to nuke you. And we don't want to go in that direction. So they're trying to convince the United States to stop the ATACMS approval. Maybe they're also trying to just wait until Trump comes in to see if Trump will stop the ATACMS thing. But it's a very dangerous situation that we're in right now. And one of the reasons is that, the intelligence community, while they were accurate in describing the system, they can't be trusted when talking about battle damage assessment, because there's a political component to this. Joe Biden made a decision, and he doesn't want to be seen as backing away, or I should say Tony Blinken made a decision on Joe Biden's half, and they don't want to be seen as backing away. So there's a political dimension to this that's also linked to America's posture with NATO. If they back down now on ATACMS, that's a kiss of death for NATO. NATO, I don't think people understand how fragile NATO is right now. In Germany, there's an upcoming election, and the AfD party, Alternative for Deutschland, is positioned to have a majority and win. And they're saying if they win, they're pulling out of the EU. That's the end of the European Union. And if the European Union collapses, NATO collapses. In France, the prime minister is facing a vote of no confidence, which will probably pass, meaning there will be the collapse of the French government. This was Macron's desperate attempt to avoid the fact that a right-wing anti-war party had won the majority of the vote. He instead put together a minority government that is incapable of governing, so it will collapse. They will have to turn to the right, and they're not inclined to support any of this escalation inside Ukraine. So, NATO's very, very much in trouble. The Biden administration is positioning itself to say, we're going to shore up NATO as much as possible. They call it Trump proofing, so that when Trump becomes president, he won't be able to take decisive action because things will be so muddied up and mucked up between the United States, NATO, and Russia. I think Russia understands this, and you see Russia trying to be patient, which is why, look, they cleared the airspace over Kapustin Yar, which is the test facility where they launched the first Oreshnik missile about 800 kilometers away from the target that was struck. They cleared the airspace up through November 30th. Well, here we are, December 2nd already? And, there was no Oreshnik attack. And so maybe the Russians are saying, maybe the Russians got a signal saying, don't escalate, we'll work with you on the 20th. I don't know. But clearly the Russians are doing their best not to escalate this crisis. But if the ATACMS keep flying, I think, and Russia doesn't get assurances from Trump that he's going to change his policy, we're in a situation where the Russians will have no choice but to retaliate. And once they do that, they're either going to have to hit really hard, in which case you may prompt a NATO overreaction, or you'll get the same shrug from the West, and then they have to bring in more exotic weapons or hit NATO itself, and then you bring in the possibility of nuclear weapons. You asked Andre the question, what's the biggest story of the year? I think it's the biggest story of the year is Russia's new nuclear doctrine, because it's the one thing that can kill us all. And it's still very much in play. I think people should be not impressed like, wow, that's cool, but like, oh shoot, I'm scared. when Dmitry Peskov said, your attacks using ATACMS against us is not only a declaration of war by the United States against Russia, but it triggers our nuclear doctrine, meaning that if we wanted to, we could use nuclear weapons right now. You've already crossed that red line. I don't think people realize that we've already crossed the red line. How close we are to a nuclear war that would end life on the planet as we know it. So that would be my game-changing event for the year. Is, oh no, we can't talk about that because that would be the truth, and we can't handle the truth. I mean, sorry to throw that Jack Nicholson line in there, but there it is. And this is the same thing with Russia. Who the hell is Keith Kellogg? I mean, I know who he is. Guy won a Silver Star in Vietnam. He's a rock star as a junior officer. Hero. I mean, guy ran out and grabbed wounded men, brought them in under fire. I mean, that's courage that not too many people have. I'm never going to denigrate the man's courage. He was assistant division commander of the 82nd Airborne. Again, they're going to say that he's not a good military leader. Guy knows jack squat about Russia. He knows nothing about Russia. And now he's the Ukraine envoy, and he puts together this simplistic plan. I mean, who in God's name, who knows anything about Russia, would say, yes, they're going to freeze the front line, inclusive of Ukrainian troops in Kursk? That ain't going to happen. First of all, they're not going to freeze the front line. They have an objective, which is that all of the 4 territories that have been absorbed by Russia constitutionally, all that territory will belong to Russia. That's an objective. So they're not going to freeze the front line. They're going to say, no, the front line will be where we decide it's going to be at the end. They're going to say there has to be a buffer zone now because Ukraine is attacked. So there will be a buffer zone, not of Ukrainian forces in Kursk, but of Russian forces in Sumy. They're not going to allow 100,000 NATO troops to come in and patrol that line. That just isn't going to happen because Ukraine will never be part of NATO. This notion that in 10 years Ukraine will be NATO, Russia says never. And it's going to be never because Russia is winning. The idea that Russia would freeze the conflict and then yield to all these ridiculous points because somehow does Trump not understand that while Russia would love to have sanctions lifted, they're not going to give up their victory just to get sanctions lifted. They're doing okay. They found a way around it. And it's Europe that's doing quite bad. And it's the United States that's paying residual, negative residuals from the European economic collapse. Why would Russia give this all away? This is amateur thinking, and it's reinforced by the fact that he has surrounded himself with people who don't know anything about Russia. Because again, we come down to the fundamentals here. To know something about Russia, you got to go to Russia. You got to meet with the Russians. They had a wonderful ambassador, Anatoly Antonov. Tony Blinken should have been having lunch with this guy once a week. They should have been inviting him into the White House to talk. This is what Kennedy did with Khrushchev back in the Cuban Missile Crisis to resolve these issues. No, they isolated him, didn't talk to him. There's no talking going on, which means you know nothing about what's going on inside Russia, which means when it comes time to assess things about Russia, you get it wrong because there's political motivations attached. We need Russia to have collusion here, even though it's just a made-up concept by Hillary Clinton. The CIA and the FBI immediately start going out and finding evidence of collusion. I mean, some of it's manufactured, Steele's dossier. Others are just taken out of context. You can get a phone call with anybody saying anything in Moscow and isolate it and say, see, right there, that's collusion. There's no collusion taking place. It's a dream. And now we have a situation where they're talking about, Russia, the CIA, the intelligence community just came out with an assessment that said, Russia's not serious about nuclear weapons. They're not going to use nuclear weapons. Don't worry about it. It's all a bluff. Then Russia publishes a new nuclear doctrine that says, yeah, we've lowered the threshold. And, oh, by the way, you're already over the threshold. So you keep firing ATACMS at us, and we're telling you the direction we can go. And yet the CIA, who we're supposed to trust, the guys who manufacture collusion, the guys who have to tell Biden that Russia's weak so that Biden can sign off on the ATACMS strikes against Ukraine, despite the fact that the Department of Defense already said, no, they're serious. We don't want to do this. So let's just keep the Department of Defense out of its decision-making. We'll go straight forward with Blinken greenlighting this thing. We're to trust the intelligence community about this life and death issue. And why should we trust him? When was the last time somebody in the intelligence community met with Vladimir Putin? Met with his senior leadership? I know, and William Burns, the director of the CIA, has this relationship, but it's a poisoned relationship. It's meaningless now because he can't be trusted. But otherwise, there's nobody meeting. I've had more meaningful relationships with senior Russian officials than the CIA has, or the State Department has in the last couple of years. But God forbid they tap somebody like me to come in and advise, because you can't. Oh, he's pro-Putin. No, I'm pro-American, man. I just want to avoid a nuclear war, and I think if you want to have good relations with Russia, you need to understand the Russian perspective. Keith Kellogg doesn't. Sebastian Gorka doesn't. Michael Waltz doesn't. None of these people know anything about Russia, and yet they're advising the president on some of the most sensitive Russian issues. So it's this is what happens. We get this fantasy world that's crafted by people who don't know anything about the world we live in, but all they know is the fantasy they've created. That it's premised on what America needs and wants. It's going to get. Where we create our own reality. If you remember, the Bush administration once said that we don't need to deal with facts. We create our own reality. And Trump is very much from that school. He believes he can come in and make 2 magic phone calls and bring an end to this conflict. He's going to be sadly disappointed. He may have leverage over Ukraine, but he doesn't have any leverage over Russia.